Here is a list of tips and advice for learning English with the best English stories. Just listen. First of all, you don't really have to do much more than just listen to the episodes. I realized some time ago that many English students I met at school in London did not listen to enough authentic English. They were willing to spend money and travel across the world to improve their English. Yet, for some reason, most of them were not prepared to take a bit of time every day to listen to something in English. Why? I think, partly, this is because they didn't know what to listen to. A lot of people watch TV and movies in English. Fine, but honestly, that might not be the best way to improve your English. Film is very visual. A lot of what you understand from a movie is visual storytelling. It's important to just focus on the audio, on the language. So, a lot of students didn't know what to listen to. They thought they didn't have much choice. Actually, there's plenty of choice out there. The BBC has plenty of podcasts, and there are loads of podcasts on different topics on iTunes. But they're all made for native speakers. They're too difficult to listen to, and ultimately, that's not motivating. There are some podcasts out there which are made for learners of English, but a lot of them are just focused on language learning at the expense of entertainment. They're useful, but they're a bit dull. This is less the case now because 5 years after starting this podcast, there are more interesting things out there for learners of English, including my podcast. So, I decided that I'd try to create something for learners of English to listen to that they would actually want to listen to beyond just learning English. Ultimately, I think, to listen to English for extended periods of time, you have to have an interest in what is being talked about, or you have to find it entertaining. Otherwise, it's hard to really sustain your concentration, and it becomes like a chore. There is real value in listening to English for extended periods of time, but it's difficult to achieve because you get put off by not understanding things or because the recording is a bit patronizing and dull. I don't want to blow my own trumpet here too much because I'm sure that my podcast is not always as entertaining or as engaging as it could be, but I think the only way to get people to keep listening is to try and make it entertaining as well as informative about English. So I record this podcast with you in mind, but I try to keep it as authentic as possible. I try to avoid being simplistic. I try not to grade my English too much. I know it might be challenging for you sometimes, but I attempt to hold your attention by talking in an enthusiastic way about subjects which I personally find interesting. Hopefully, the result is that you keep listening and that you feel personally involved in it somehow. Then, by exposing yourself to lots of English in this way, you are able to acquire the language, to pick it up in a variety of ways. Stephen Krashen and Language Acquisition Theory. Let me now refer to the language acquisition theory of Stephen Krashen. This theory is very well known among language learning theorists, and it underpins a lot of what we know about learning and teaching English. Krashen believed that there are 2 ways to develop our language learning skills. One is through language acquisition, and the other is through language learning. Language acquisition means that it is possible for adults and children to learn language in a subconscious way, meaning in a kind of passive way, by simply engaging with the language. The important thing is that you focus on the message in a bit of language. So, when listening to Best English Stories podcast, this means focusing exactly on what I really mean, rather than just on the specific items of language I'm using. The primary focus is to just understand what I mean, hopefully at a fairly deep level, in order to laugh at something I've said or feel moved by it. and then you kind of pick up the language as a result of that. You might not be immediately aware that you've learned some new language in this way. In fact, this kind of acquisition probably informs your passive knowledge of the language. According to Krashen, another type of language development is language learning. This is when you focus on learning specific forms, like studying grammar rules, for example. It involves having some instruction by a teacher, perhaps in the form of error correction, or from a grammar book, which explains the rules of English. The downside of this kind of learning is that it is rather dogmatic, can be boring, complex, and abstract. It doesn't necessarily replicate the organic way in which we pick up language as children, and doesn't quite allow the subconscious acquisition of language that occurs from just engaging with the language in order to understand a message being communicated. All right, so how does this apply to the way you can learn English? Well, I think it's pretty important to get both aspects of language learning into your life. This is what I call having a balanced diet. You shouldn't just study the grammar rules in a dogmatic way, although that is undeniably important. You should also attempt to just engage with the language as it is used in natural, authentic, and meaningful situations. How can you do that? Ideally, this would mean going out into the world and doing things in English. In fact, this might be the best way to improve your English. If you get a job that requires you to use English all day, you will improve quickly.